Pope Leo XIV responds to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a message of truth, justice, and reconciliation. In a historic and deeply resonant letter, Pope Leo XIV has delivered a sweeping response to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, addressing the wounds of colonialism, economic injustice, cultural theft, and the future of Africa within the global church. The Pope's message, echoing across continents, stands as a clarion call for truth, justice, and reconciliation, not only between Rome and Ouagadougou, but for the entire world. The Pope's message, echoing across continents, stands as a clarion call for truth, justice, and reconciliation, not only between Rome and Ouagadougou, but for the entire world. Pope Leo XIV's letter does not begin with the usual diplomatic pleasantries. Instead, he acknowledges President Traoré's message as a cry of the soul, powerful, principled, and painful. The Pope recognizes the depth of Africa as suffering, a continent that has known too much loss, too much silence, and too many broken promises. He admits that the church has at times stood with colonizers rather than the crucified, and bows his head in repentance for the sins of both omission and commission that have marred the church's history on African soil. In a rare moment of institutional self-examination, Pope Leo XIV confesses that colonialism was not just a political conquest, but a spiritual betrayal. He recalls how missionaries, sometimes sincere, arrived with crosses in one hand, but behind them followed gunboats and contracts of domination. The gospel was never meant to conquer, it was meant to liberate. Christ was never a colonizer, he was a carpenter from Nazareth, brown-skinned, occupied, poor. The Pope pledges that his papacy must be different. He promises that the church will not dwell in guilt, but will root out denial, and that it must become not a reminder of conquest, but a refuge for cultural rebirth. The next chapter, he insists, must be written by African hands, in African languages, in full ownership of a faith that was never truly foreign. Economic injustice, naming the architects. Pope Leo XIV does not shy away from the economic realities facing Africa. He calls out the paradox of a continent rich in resources. Gold, uranium, oil, while its people remain poor. These were supposed to be gifts of providence, not instruments of plunder, he writes. The Pope denounces engineered stagnation, orchestrated debt, and predatory agreements signed in glass towers while farmers walked barefoot through dust. He admits that the church has often been too quiet when it should have cried out, too cautious when it should have stood between the vulnerable and the vultures. In a bold promise, Leo XIV declares, "We will no longer speak of poverty without naming its architects. We will challenge institutions that pretend benevolence while negotiating for control behind closed doors." The church, he vows, must fight for equity, not just advocate for aid, sovereignty, and self-determination. Addressing the issue of sovereignty, Pope Leo XIV affirms that sovereignty is not a luxury, it is a right, a divine dignity rooted in creation itself. He acknowledges the centuries of interference, first by colonial powers, now by global interests, that continue to shape Africa's destiny. The Pope calls for an end to, quote, policies and treaties that bind nations in economic shackles while pretending to offer freedom, and promises that the church will support only those governments that derive their authority from the consent of their people. On migration, the Pope's voice is unequivocal. Migration is not a crime. The criminal is not the refugee, but the warlord armed with weapons from Western factories, the profiteer who manipulates currency markets, the consultant who designs plans that never develop the people. He urges the world to see beyond statistics to the human stories of mothers, children, and youth risking everything for survival. If your wealth was built on Africa's back, then your borders cannot be closed to her pain. He calls for nations worth staying in, where brilliance is not exported but embraced, and where young Africans can lead rather than leave. Cultural restitution and the theft of memory. Pope Leo XIV's message is especially poignant on the issue of cultural theft. He calls the removal of Africa's treasures a looting of memory and acknowledges that without memory, a people cannot heal, cannot rise, cannot know who they truly are. He demands the return of artifacts, manuscripts, and sacred objects, not as charity, but as justice. Culture is not a souvenir, it is a seed, and Africa's children deserve to plant it back into the soil of their own nations. He urges the church to teach theology with humility, to preach Christ without erasing identity, and to recognize that Jesus can wear African robes, speak in African proverbs, walk through African landscapes, and he loses nothing of his divinity. Africa's prophetic role in the future church. Pope Leo XIV recognizes Africa not as the church's future, but as its present and its soul. He celebrates the courage of Christians and Muslims in Burkina Faso, where the church bleeds yet does not break, and calls for more African cardinals, saints, and theologians, not as symbols, but as shepherds and co-authors of doctrine. Let the church be a symphony, not a solo. Let the Vatican become not just a center, but a circle. One where Africa is not just received, but revered. Forgiveness, unity, and a new beginning. In his closing, Pope Leo XIV calls for forgiveness, not as erasure of memory, but as its sanctification. Forgiveness without justice is an insult, and unity without truth is a lie. But forgiveness built on truth and unity grounded in justice. This is the foundation of a new dawn. He proposes a Vatican-African Commission to audit not only aid, but conscience, and to shape a future together. The Pope's message is clear. Africa is not a burden, but a beacon. The church must walk with Africa, not as patron, but as partner, not as teacher, but as pilgrim. In this moment, he extends his hand, not just in words, but in commitment. Let this be not merely an exchange of letters, but the birth of a covenant. May the God of justice walk beside you. May the Christ of the poor dwell within you. And may the spirit of reconciliation unite us all.